Welcome all of you out there in the sky somewhere. We're happy today to have Dr. Alvin Camba with us, and we're going to talk about the Philippines. And the Philippines has about 110 million people and many islands, and has claims of part of the China Sea that China wants for itself. At the end of July this year, President Rodrigo Duterte withdrew a year-and-a-half-old threat to cancel a key security pact with the United States. The pact is called the Philippines-United States Visiting Forces Agreement. The 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement makes it easier for U.S. forces and ships to operate in the Philippines, including conducting large combat exercises that have alarmed China. Rodrigo Duterte has derided the United States and courted China through much of his time in office, putting one of America's oldest alliances in Asia in question. But now, nearing the end of his single six-year term, the mercurial leader appears to be looking more favorably towards the Americans. Duarte's turnaround comes at a time of fierce rivalry between the US and China and heightened tensions in the South China Sea. Beijing has aggressively asserted its claims in the South China Sea, and this, as I said in the introduction, has many disputed waters with Vietnam, Philippines, and other countries in that area. China's claim was ruled illegal in an international arbitration ruling. And the Biden administration is trying to reinforce relations with South Asian countries that China has been intimidating, including the Philippines. Dr. Alvin Camba, our speaker today, is an assistant professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He received his PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Camba is also a non-resident fellow at the Strata-based Alberto del Rosario Institute in the Philippines. I'm sure you will pronounce that a heck of a lot better than I will. He has contributed to policy reports for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the World Bank, and the US State Department. Professor Camba has been interviewed by the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg, and has been consulted by Southeast Asian politicians and policymakers about China's growing role in Southeast Asia. Over to you, Alvin.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for having me. And we'll talk about U.S.-Philippine relations in the next 40 to 45 minutes. Let me open my presentation. Okay, let me just open this and I can start. So just a bit of a background about myself. I work on China and the Philippines, and China and Southeast Asia particularly. I look at the role of Chinese foreign direct investment and development finance, in the money that China gives to Southeast Asia, not the money that China lends to Southeast Asian states, in the context of the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. I'm Filipino myself, having spent the first decade of my life in the Philippines before moving around. And today I'll talk about 21st century US-Philippine relations, how Duterte used the Chinese at the expense of the Americans. Now, just to be clear, the outline of the talk is I'll first talk about the questions and argument. And then the first half of the talk, I'll talk about Duterte's rapprochement with China, which is going to draw a lot from my research as well. Then we'll talk about US-Philippine relations, and then we will conclude the talk. Now, the reason why we'll talk about China is simply because it's inevitable to talk about China when we look at US-Philippine relations. China is the largest player in East and Southeast Asia, even in South Asia. In terms of money, Chinese foreign direct investment in the globe reached 3.4 trillion by 2019. Development finance reached 600 billion. That's a lot of money. So China uses its sort of money to invest in countries as a way of like increasing its economic weight in these areas to derive political and possibly some territorial concessions as well. So inevitably, China is in the mix when we think about U.S.-Philippine relations. Of course, one can also look at U.S.-Philippine relations in a vacuum, but that will be incomplete because China is really a big part of why the United States remains to be important in the context of Southeast Asia. Now, I basically have two questions coming into this talk. Number one is, why did Duterte befriend China? It has to be clear that Rodrigo Duterte was the president, is still the president since 2016, and then by May 2022, he will no longer be the president. There's going to be the Philippine elections. It's going to take place next year. Before Duterte, in 2010 to 2016, the Philippine president Benigno Aquino III was not pro-China. In fact, he was very pro-American, and he created a lot of like Philippine United States treaties and agreements to sort of strengthen the relationship of both countries together. Now, before Aquino, there was a female president by the name of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo between 2001 and 2010. In fact, Arroyo was a good friend of former President Bill Clinton in the United States. Arroyo was also friendly to China, but in comparison to Duterte, Arroyo's friendship with China was not that deep compared to like what Duterte did. So the first question in the talk is, why did Duterte befriend China? And there are many reasons here, but I'm gonna give my reason that really draws from my research in the Philippines. And when I was finishing my PhD, I did research on the Philippines for about 1 year, conducting field work, doing interviews with Philippine government officials of like different departments. I did field research as well, looking at like politicians in the Philippines across different presidencies, and analyzing the Chinese projects in the Philippines during between 2001 and 2000, well, up until right now 2021. The second question is, what is the state of U.S.-Philippine relations? And this question really focuses on what is happening today between the U.S. and the Philippines. Now, as Don said, Rodrigo Duterte started his administration a bit antagonistic to the United States. In fact, I think he called former President Obama a son of a whore in a 2014 forum I think it was an ASEAN forum in 2014 before Obama stepped down. Oh wait, not 2014, it was 2016 before Obama stepped down. Of course, in recent times, since China has displayed aggression in the South China Sea, Duterte seems to have mellowed down his criticism of the United States, and he has taken a more conciliatory, friendly approach towards the Americans. So, is this reason really, how empirically valid is this reason? And, what could be the other reasons why Duterte has recently befriended the United States? And I'm going to give my own take as well on like, what is really happening between the US and Philippine relations. Now, my argument in the talk is that Duterte used China in order to maximize his family's political survival, particularly by accessing Chinese development finance projects and staving off Beijing's pressure on online gambling. Now, if you read The Economist, the Financial Times, or the Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, I think if you come across an article about the Philippines, you will inevitably read an article about how Duterte kowtowed to China, and in exchange for kowtowing to China, Duterte was able to access Chinese money to build projects. But there's actually a deeper argument here, and the deeper argument that I'm making is that the projects were used as a way to reward local elites in the Philippines who ended up supporting Duterte in his 2016 elections, and at the same time, local elites who the Duterte family needs in order to move forward in their political in sort of their political campaign to to stay in power. Now, crucially, the second part of the argument about China is that Duterte needed China in order to stave off Beijing's pressure on online gambling. Now, this part may not be known as easily in this part of the world in the United States. Now, a lot of the online gambling firms are owned by former Chinese citizens who ended up fleeing China because the Chinese government is after them. A lot of the online gambling firms, they ended up fleeing to the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, a lot of this like offshore financial centers. Now, China does not like online gambling firms, but a lot of these online gambling firms invested in the Philippines in 2016. And as a result of the investments, the Duterte family was able to get a lot of rents, a lot of like side payments from the online gambling firms. And this was good for the Duterte family because this allowed them to perpetuate their economic wealth without directly, taking embezzling money from, let's say, public from like public finances or public budget. Now, China wanted the Duterte government to effectively ban online gambling firms in the Philippines. Duterte disagreed with China, and in order to get China to hold off on stopping the Philippines from accepting online gambling companies, Duterte was willing to let China do whatever China wanted in the South China Sea. And this is my own analysis on how there's an entire political economy of like side payments and like of investments that is part of the story in the South China Sea, yet it is not easily covered in media because people talk about how Duterte kowtowed to China, while in my view, it's less about him kowtowing to China. It is about him using China to effectively maximize his political survival and increase his family's access to economic rent or side payments. Now, the second part of the argument is that because Duterte was willing to let China do whatever it wanted in the South China Sea, Duterte used the Chinese at the expense of the US to maximize political survival. In maximizing political survival, US-Philippine relations suffered. But Duterte never went too far. Indeed, US-Philippine relations largely remain intact due to path dependence and formal-informal Philippine structures. China, however, has made crucial progress. And this is the state of US-Philippine relations today. It remains to be strong. It remains to be intact. Duterte used this relation as a bargaining chip to sort of like get China to stave off, let's say, its pressure on online gambling firms or get China to invest in the Philippines. Duterte was willing to use US-Philippine relations in order to pursue his political interests. Yet Duterte never went too far. And this is the point I want to emphasize. I don't think Duterte really meant to destroy US-Philippine relations. I think he simply wanted to use it as much as he could in order to extract more and more political and economic concessions from China. And this is the entirety of my argument. Now, going back again, US-Philippine relations, China-Philippine relations in 2016 blossomed. People have called this Duterte's rapprochement with China. Before Duterte became president, there was the Philippine president was Benigno Aquino III, and Benigno Aquino III, he was very pro-American. There was the dispute in the South China Sea in 2012 in an area called the Scarborough Shoal. In that particular context, it made the Philippine government under Aquino launch a case in the Hague Tribunal in 2014. The Philippines effectively won the case in 2014. The Hague Tribunal said in the disputed island, China did wrong and China should withdraw from like the islands. I mean, not the entire South China Sea, just the specific shoals and specific islands. Beijing was unhappy with the Hague Tribunal, and it effectively led to really, really bad relations between the Philippines and China. Lo and behold, Rodrigo Duterte came in power in 2016, and this was really good for the Chinese because finally they have somebody they can talk to. Duterte was willing to let the Hague Tribunal the Hague Tribunal victory, he was willing to let it go. And in exchange for letting it go, Duterte and China, they were able to rekindle their relations. This was the October 2016 visit in Beijing, when Duterte and his government officials, along with 200 businessmen in the Philippines, visited China. And they've talked about, rekindling political economic relations. The Philippines and China agreed on 24 foreign direct investment development finance agreements that was approximately around $24 billion. Note that this agreement was just an agreement. There wasn't really, there was very little substantial outcomes that came from this agreement in terms of the $24 billion. A side note is I actually was in Beijing at this time doing research. I knew the businessmen who were going to be there because some of my personal connections and friends were part of this group. And I went there to Beijing, and I was not able to attend any formal, what they call this formal event. But when my businessmen friends were touring the city or doing something else, I joined them. I joined up, and then I was able to get the stories of what was happening between Duterte and Xi Jinping at that time. Now, a lot of Chinese projects enter the Philippines, and this comes from my research of Chinese projects in the Philippines during Duterte. So these are all key projects during Duterte's time. Now, I did say that the $24 billion agreement amounted to nothing. But just because it amounted to nothing, it doesn't mean that there were no substantial progress between the Philippines and China. And in fact, there were projects that continued and projects that moved forward that allowed Chinese money to enter the Philippines. And these are some of the projects. You have a recently completed telecommunications project, a $2.5 billion investment, where pro-Duterte business elite became the partner of the Chinese, and they were able to create the third telecommunication company in the Philippines at the expense of Philippine business elites and their foreign partners. There are other projects as well, from railways to dam projects to bridges to airports. Now, do note that only two of the projects have been completed. Most of the projects are progressing, but they're going to be completed soon. A lot of the projects are almost done. So whoever becomes the next Philippine president is going to sign off on the projects anyway. So yeah, there are a lot of Chinese development finance projects in the Philippines. I think this is approximately 9. I think one of this has been canceled, and then there's been 2 or 3 more that came in, and they're constructing it right now. Now, just to be clear, even though there are 9 to 11 Chinese projects during Duterte's time, these projects are still very small in terms of their numbers, because the biggest funder of development finance in the Philippines remains to be the Japanese. Japan has been in the Philippines since the 1960s with the help of the Americans, and Japan has been the biggest funder of infrastructure and development projects in the country. And even in Duterte's time, approximately 50% of development finance projects are funded by the Japanese, not funded by the Chinese. So I think between 2016 and 2021, there were 120 development finance projects in the Philippines, infrastructure projects and loans. Approximately half of 120 are funded by the Japanese. The Chinese are only funding 9 to 11 of them. So the Japanese still remains to be the biggest player when it comes to infrastructure projects and development finance, not the Chinese. So it will be difficult to overstate the role of the Chinese. Nonetheless, they still have a role. During Aquino's time in 2010 to 2016, the Chinese funded 0 projects because the Philippines and China hated each other. During Duterte's time, the number of projects increased to 9 to 11 out of 120. It's a small number, yet it still means something. That means the Chinese are still progressing in the country, despite the numbers being far smaller than the Japanese. Now, this number is foreign direct talks about foreign direct investments. The graph here points to the number of new firms in the Philippines with a select foreign entity. Now, so the number here is not, this is foreign direct investment, but I'm not talking about US dollars. I'm talking about in every year, if there is a new company in the Philippines, formed with a foreign entity, how many would those companies be? And as you can see from the graph, this graph, I created this graph. I look at the Security Exchange Commission records in the Philippines. This would be the the United States has its own Security Exchange Commission, and in a Security Exchange Commission, you can see the companies registered in the country, and you can see the investors of those companies, who those people are, how much did they invest, and when did they begin their like operations. So I look at the same thing in the Philippines, and as you can see, during the this is not cumulative. This is like these are discrete numbers. And as you can see, from 2016 during the Duterte, the number of Chinese companies really increased. It's increased by a lot. I think there were 1,500 companies that were formed, in 2018 alone. Now, just to be clear, a lot of these companies are private companies. That means that they're not sponsored by the Chinese government in a direct way. As you can see, the number of companies also increased during Aquino, even though Aquino was anti-China president. But the reason why I have this graph, and the number of Chinese companies definitely outpaced the American, Japanese, Singapore, and Taiwanese companies. The reason I have this graph is to illustrate the increasing amount of Chinese money in the Philippines. Now, just to be clear, a lot of these Chinese companies are small. Usually, they are joint venture partners with Philippine businesses dealing with retail, wholesale, very basic activities like construction, or sort of like some sort of like really small extractive industry, like wood, or like some sort of small business. Nonetheless, so Chinese money is definitely increasing in the Philippines since Duterte. Even though these companies are not funded by the Chinese government, they are encouraged by the positive relations between the Philippines and China, and therefore the number of Chinese companies in the Philippines has effectively increased. Now, I want to demonstrate two Chinese projects in the Philippines, two big Chinese projects in the Philippines. And I want to show how Duterte effectively used the Chinese projects in order to strengthen his political power in the Philippines, in order to maximize his political survival. And I will draw from the paper I published in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, how Duterte strong-arm Chinese dam builders but weakened Philippine institutions. And I draw from this paper rather than my academic works, largely because I rewrote this paper 16 times. It was really difficult to write because I wanted to write it for a non-academic audience. So it's very readable. At the same time, this paper got around the Japanese government, and I even got an email from the Japanese, one of top officials from the Japanese Asian Development Bank and the Japanese Infrastructure Cooperation Organization, congratulating me for publishing this paper. And they said that they were going to assign this paper to bureaucrats they train, the Japanese bureaucrats they train, before these bureaucrats are deployed to Southeast Asia, including the Philippines. Now, the key takeaways of the paper is that Duterte needed to use two Chinese projects to reward key Philippine elites. And these are two projects. One is the Kaliwad Dam. It's a dam project. It's a project that reroutes water from one part of the Philippines to another. The other is the Chico River Pump Irrigation Project. It's also a dam project, but it's much smaller. When these projects were conceptualized in the Philippines, or when they were negotiated between China and the Philippines, China was not imposing terms on the Philippine government. In fact, it was marked by compromise. The Chinese were willing to give concessions to the Philippine government when it comes to the projects. The Philippines were willing to give other concessions to China. So this dominant idea that, the Chinese actually comes in and sort of like imposes projects on countries, that is not true. In fact, what effectively happens in many projects, and both the academic literature and my own works illustrate these trends, is that it's usually a compromise between the local elites, in this particular case, the Philippines, and the Chinese. And it is precisely this compromise that makes the Chinese so appealing to leaders in the global south, including very corrupt leaders in the Philippines. Because you have the Chinese willing to compromise to the local elites, it allows the local elites to change the terms of the projects in order to benefit themselves. In this particular case, Duterte wanted to use one of the project to benefit the military because one of the project was designed to be constructed around areas where the military could effectively justify creating a military base in order to strengthen their jurisdiction in the country. The other project that the Chinese were funded, it was a project that was built around the indigenous people areas in the Philippines and funnels water from the indigenous areas in the Philippines to the lowland areas that are owned by landlords, so Philippine landowners who needed water for free in order to increase their coconut production. And the coconut production would lead to coconut exports that were effectively exported to China. Now, had Duterte chose the Japanese to fund both projects, the Japanese would have objected, largely because the projects violated human rights, the projects violated social environmental standards. And if the Japanese objected to the projects, Duterte would not have been able to reward the local elites. So crucially, what I'm illustrating here is that it is precisely because the Chinese are flexible to the demands of the local elites that the local elites choose the Chinese to fund those projects, and this is effectively what happened in the Philippines. So this is a village that I visited in 2018. The project, the Kaliwa Dam project, effectively removes around 13 villages, basically kicks out the population, the villagers, and puts them elsewhere. The Philippine government up until now has not been able to build them a relocation site. When I visited this village, it was empty. It was a population of like, I think 300 people, and then nobody was there. This is the Chico River Pump Irrigation Project. Again, this project moves water from the indigenous group areas to the local landlords, and the landlords use the water to expand coconut production in order to increase their exports to China. Now, effectively, what I illustrate in this paper is that host country actors, particularly the Philippine elites, they also determine what happens to Chinese money. It is not through the Chinese money, comes in the country and tells the country what to do. More often than not, it is about Chinese money comes in and gives the opportunity to local actors to use that money for their own gains. And this is what makes China attractive. I disaggregate Philippine political actors in my work. I get away from defining the actor as corrupt or passive alone. I look at their agency and I look at their capacity to wield decisions in order to pursue their political interest and political gain. Now, so this is one case where Duterte used the Chinese in order to strengthen his political power because he was able to reward local elites. Now, the other example I will show is Duterte and online gambling. And I think I alluded to this I explained some of this at the start of the presentation. And if I can explain this a bit more, online gambling firms, you can think of them as like Las Vegas casino, except that you don't need to go to Las Vegas to actually play, to actually gamble. You can go online and then you can gamble. You can actually gamble there. That's basically what online gambling is. You have to put your credit card in, it takes away money from you. Now, Chinese online gambling, the companies operate using the Chinese language, and they use Chinese programs to take away money from you. But you can gamble anywhere, even in the United States. Chinese online gambling companies target the Asian families in the United States, including my family. Now, Chinese online gambling firms, a lot of them are I would call them renegade firms coming from China. The Chinese government does not want them. The Chinese government thinks they're criminal enterprises. But a lot of these enterprises are owned by former Chinese citizens, usually Chinese billionaires, who escaped China because of Xi Jinping, who is an increasingly powerful autocratic Chinese president who is stopping anybody from contesting his power. So online gambling firms, a lot of them escaped China. Some of them actually are in the United States. Some of them are in Europe. Most of them are in the offshore financial centers. Now, when online gambling firms operate, they need to invest in countries like the Philippines in order to expand their operations because the offshore financial centers are really, really small. The online gambling firms, they used to be in Fiji, in the Pacific Islands, I think between 2008 and 2014. The Chinese government went to Fiji and told Fiji, we're not going to give you money, we're not going to give you assistance if you keep accepting online gambling firms. So Fiji said, okay, we're gonna ban online gambling and we're gonna stop them from investing here. The same thing happened in Cambodia. If anybody is familiar with Cambodia, Cambodia is a small Southeast Asian country. It's under the dictatorship of General Hun Sen, who is a close friend of Chinese President Xi Jinping. And Cambodia is very pro-China, yet Hun Sen accepted a lot of online gambling investments in 2014 when online gambling firms were kicked out of Fiji. Now, in 2017, Xi Jinping told Hun Sen, stop online gambling firm investments. Otherwise, we're going to stop supporting your regime. So Hun Sen effectively stopped accepting online gambling firms in Cambodia. The famous case here is the city of Sihanoukville. It's this like really, really small island beach resort, beach village in Cambodia. I've been there myself in 2019. It was a really small island village, or sorry, a beach village, not on an island. Cambodia is a landlocked country. A lot of Chinese online gambling firms went there, and from a small village, it transformed into this like very, very messy city with skyscrapers and like crazy amount of like buildings. And it turned the village into this into this dirty sort of like small city that's populated by mafia members and online gambling firms. And kidnapping and extortion happens a lot. So the same thing happened in the Philippines. When online gambling firms went to the Philippines, Duterte accepted them. And Duterte gets a lot of money from online gambling firms. I think his family gets around $10 million a month in 2016. His family and his local collaborator, the other elites. Now, China could have told the Philippines, stop accepting online gambling firm investments. Otherwise, we're not going to give you money. However, remember that China needed Duterte. China needed Duterte to give up the South China Sea. And because China needed Duterte, China could not pressure the Philippines into stopping their support for online gambling firms. And I want to show this by my interview with I interviewed a Chinese embassy official in Manila on September 17, 2019. The Chinese embassy filed extradition cases against Chinese citizens working in online gambling firms in the Philippines. And according to the embassy official, we filed so many extradition cases against high-level individuals involved in online gambling. These high-level individuals are Chinese citizens between 2017 and 2019. But we are only getting workers. What can we do? We can pressure Duterte because other things are more important. What I'm pointing here is that China values Duterte because Duterte was willing to let go of the South China Sea. And as a result, China stopped pressuring the Philippines. Duterte staved off Chinese pressure, and online gambling firm investments massively expanded in the Philippines between 2016 and 2020. And as a result, the Duterte family got a lot of side payments. If it's $10 million a month, that means it is a lot of money in 4 years. And you have to think, where's the money going to go? Of course, elections are coming up, and politicians need money during elections to buy off political supporters or buy off the voters. So I'm effectively illustrating that this relationship between the Philippines and China is not just a question of geopolitics, not just a question of, oh, Duterte is a puppet of the Chinese, or that Duterte is, controlled by the Chinese. It's not that simple. Duterte effectively is using the Chinese to pursue his political gain. So I would characterize Duterte not as a puppet, not as a Chinese lapdog. Duterte is a highway bandit. He's a bandit in the Philippines, and he used China to strengthen his own like company, his bandit company, at the expense of everything else. And this is the first part of my argument. It is to illustrate the agency that Duterte had in using the Chinese to strengthen his political power. The second part of my presentation is I'll talk about what did it mean for U.S.-Philippine relations, and crucially, I want to start off with this article came out in I think on September 12, 2016. Duterte wanted U.S. Special Forces out of southern Philippines. So Duterte is known for his bombastic statements, and he's known for making anti-American remarks and pro-China remarks. But Duterte called for the withdrawal of U.S. Special Forces, but Philippine officials reinterpreted Duterte and reinterpreted the withdrawal. According to Ernesto Abella, who was the Undersecretary of Strategic Communications under Duterte, the policy on withdrawing U.S. special forces, it's not a policy yet. Nobody acted on it yet. Another official, I'm sorry, this is a mistake. This is I forgot to remove the name. The name of this person is Hermogenes. I forgot, but this is another official. I mistakenly failed to remove this. But the National Security Advisor said that he interpreted Duterte's comments about special forces to be the last for the year, but not the last permanently. So what the quotes effectively illustrate is that Philippine officials reinterpreted Duterte's statements and tempered it. It wasn't that Duterte was telling the Americans to get out of the Philippines. He was in terms of public venue, but Philippine officials were reinterpreting the statements in order to temper the claims. It's quite similar to the Trump administration when Donald Trump makes a statement about a particular issue, and the statement comes in a very hard line fashion. American officials would later come in and like tell the American public or the world that, oh, he doesn't mean it this way, he means it this way. So people were doing the same thing for Duterte. Now, as what I said a while ago, Duterte told Obama to go to hell, and Duterte called Obama a son of a whore. So largely because Obama was concerned about human rights issues in the Philippines, and Duterte had this war on drugs, which was bad for, was like killing people. So it was definitely harmful to the human rights agenda. Duterte and Trump, however, had a great relationship. Donald Trump visited the Philippines in 2017. There was the Southeast Asian Forum in the Philippines, and I was there myself. I attended the forum and I did my interviews with officials. And Duterte and Trump were actually, they were publicly friends. I don't think I don't think this amounted to anything meaningful. I think even if Obama was the president, or even if you have a pro human rights president in the United States, I don't think it would change U.S.-Philippine relationship. But this is a sort of a funny episode where two leaders who are quite similar to each other in some ways, not completely, became friends, at least in public. Now, going back again, just to talk about the Hague Ruling. The Hague Ruling is this is the ruling that gave the Philippines legitimacy. This is the 2014 ruling that told China to leave those like particular islands and particular shoals. Interesting enough, in 2016, Duterte said the ruling meant nothing. He was willing to throw it away. On May 7, 2021, Duterte affirmed the Philippines Hague victory. Actually, this is not 2000. Duterte affirmed it quite early, even before May 7. So this is like the date is wrong, but there was a United Nations I think conference last year in 2020, and Duterte went to the conference and said the Philippines was willing to stand by the Hague Tribunal. But on May 6, 2021, Duterte belittles Hague Ruling, and he said that I'll throw it in a wastebasket. What I'm demonstrating here is that Duterte Duterte is very contradictory. He would make statements to belittle the United States. His officials would temper it later, and then sometimes if he would use the Hague Rule. Sometimes he would contradict his own statements. So, um, what analysts usually get wrong about the Philippines is that they follow Duterte's statements instead of following Duterte's actions. And if you look at the statements, they're very contradictory. If you look at the actions in the Philippines, nothing has changed so much. Philippine-US relations have remained intact in terms of like the mutual defense agreement. And there were some issues about like the visiting forces agreement, but I don't think there were much changes at that during those times. Now, this is an issue in the Wisdom Reef. This happened last year in 2020. There were Chinese ships that went to the Wisdom Reef, Chinese militia ships. They were not Chinese Navy, they were militia ships. They stopped Philippine fishermen from conducting their fishing operations, their fishing activities in the area, and it was more or less squatting in another person's property. Now, the Philippines, the normal response here would be to send the Navy. But if the Philippines sends its Navy to police the Chinese militia, China would then be given the legitimacy to send its own Navy. And because China has a far more powerful Navy than the Philippines did not send any navies at all. Nonetheless, in the United States, in 2020 as well, they conducted the freedom of navigation operations, and then with American and Philippine ships, they passed by the Wisdom Reef, and it effectively scared the Chinese militia. I'm sorry, this was not last year. This was I think this was around the summer this year. But what this demonstrates is that, in fact, this is what happened. U.S. bolsters South China Sea presence as tensions at Wisdom Reef rose. The United States sailed in that area and effectively scared the Chinese. So I'm demonstrating here that despite Duterte's statements in his contradictory, bombastic remarks, U.S.-Philippine relations still remain strong. It has barely changed. This is a recent incident that happened last week. I think it happened a few days ago, not last week. This is part of the Philippines. This is the Palawan Islands. The Ayungin Shoal, there were Chinese ships there. They were again squatting. They were intimidating any Philippine fishing vessels from conducting operations in the area. And Duterte calls out China's water cannon attack versus Philippine vessels en route to the Ayungin Shoal. So interesting enough, even though Duterte is pro-China, he was willing to say something against the Chinese at certain times. And this happened November 22. This just happened a few days ago. So, U.S.-Philippine relations do have remained strong. And even though there were some changes on the margins, Duterte terminates the visiting forces agreement. The visiting forces agreement is the post 1991 agreement between the Philippine and the American military that transfer weapons and conduct operations and training for the Philippine military. Now, the visiting forces agreement does contain parts on maritime training, so the training of Philippine Navy. So when Duterte announced that the training or the visiting forces agreement would be terminated, the joint training between the Philippines and the United States effectively stopped, at least temporarily. And by stopping the visiting forces agreement, joint trainings were stopped, but not all the other operations. So military transfers and disaster relief operations and some of the agreements around weapons, they were not stopped by stopping the visiting forces agreement. As I demonstrated a while ago, the Philippines and the United States, they both sailed together around the Wisdom Reef to effectively scare the Chinese. Now, this happened, I think, a month ago. Duterte restores Philippines' key military agreement with the United States. He, after threatening the United States with, terminating the agreement, Duterte did not do anything. He effectively said that, oh, the agreement should continue and it should just go as planned. Now, there are some pundits who, they don't really do grounded research in the Philippines, but they read the statements a lot. This is a pundit. He's a great pundit, but the senior analyst at the Rand Corporation said, China lost the Philippines despite Duterte's best efforts. And then he made another one and he said that Duterte's dalliance with China is over. Now, this guy makes an argument that Duterte was a Chinese puppet, and therefore, when Duterte realized that the Chinese are going to be aggressive in the South China Sea, Duterte just went back to the Americans. And I disagree with this assessment largely because I don't think Duterte was ever serious about scrapping the visiting forces agreement, and I don't think he was really serious about sort of like destroying relations with the Americans. I don't think he was serious about these things. In fact, one can interpret what Duterte is doing in the South China Sea as a result of online gambling. So when the pandemic happened in March 2020, a lot of online gambling in the Philippines left, and they left because they could not make any money anymore because operations in the Philippines had to stop. So when online gambling left the Philippines, Duterte now lost the reason why he was letting the Chinese, get away with whatever it wanted. So all of this instances of the Western Rift and the Ayungin Shoal, the Philippines fighting back, and Duterte statements about China, they all happened after online gambling firms left the Philippines. And to go back to the argument that I made, online gambling firms were really important to Duterte because they gave money, they paid side payments to the Duterte government. And the Chinese government, wherever they go, they pressure countries into banning online gambling firms. And when online gambling firms were no longer there because they could not profit because of the pandemic, Duterte had no more reason to give way to Beijing. He had no more reason to appease China by letting them do whatever they wanted in the South China Sea. So in my analysis, that is really what happened in terms of the South China Sea. It's not a question of geopolitics or Duterte realizing the Chinese are not friends. It's simply a question of, oh, I don't get paid anymore because the gambling firms are not here. Then I need to find another way to increase my legitimacy and to sort of fight back. The other issue is that elections are coming up in 2022. Duterte needed to make it appear that he's a strong leader that's willing to fight back against the Chinese. Now, final slide, why are Philippine-US relations strong? Institutional linkages, particularly among US-Philippine government officials, remain strong. Institutional change takes a long time. The Philippines was an American colony since 1899 until 1945. American influence in the Philippines is very strong. There are 5 million Filipinos in the United States, including Filipino Americans and people like myself who move here. So it would take a long time to sort of see Philippines that is really under China. Nobody in the social sciences would argue that countries change immediately. It takes a long time to change. I mean, look at what happened in Afghanistan. 20 years of American rule, American American tutelage. Nothing has happened. Nothing substantial has happened. I mean, very few things have happened, but you still have the Taliban there and huge anti-American sentiments in the country. Nonetheless, so going back to the Philippines, China has made real progress under Duterte. It has not substantially changed the country, yet it really, really influenced. It really changed the direction of the country, and there are more and more pro-China sentiments right now. Duterte is all about maximizing political survival. I'll end in 2 minutes, I'm sorry. Duterte is all about maximizing political survival. He was never serious about weakening US-Philippine agreement, but wanted to appease China in order for online gambling to remain untouched. When online gambling investments decreased, Duterte became more aggressive towards China. Key takeaways. Duterte used the Chinese at the expense of the US to maximize political survival, but he never went too far. Philippine-US relations remain strong. Crucially, it is not about geopolitics, but politics, legitimacy and rent-seeking by Philippine officials. I have a big research agenda here. I've published many academic articles and non-academic articles. If you're interested, please look at them. Apart from that, I just want to say thank you very much for being here and for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions.
Here we go. I'm trying to get back. There we are. I'm pushing all the buttons. Anyway, thank you, Alvin. I can see now why, I don't know if she's a colleague of yours or not, but a professor at the University of Texas gave me your name as an expert in the Philippines, And I think that all of us who have listened to you this past 50 minutes or so would come to the same conclusion as Professor Grossman did in indicating you are our man. So here you are. And you have changed completely, as you no doubt intended to do, my understanding of the rationale behind the love affair between the Philippines and China. And you can see why now the New York Times and others are predicting how the current president's family will be involved in the elections in some way that they can work out to continue their continuation as the power people, the power family in the Philippines. What I'm wondering about as your talk went on was how much local control does the Duarte family have within the Philippines? One of the ideas for that question came from the fact that only 25%, a quarter of the Philippine peoples, have had a COVID vaccination. And that seems to indicate to me that the national government has no great influence on what's going on throughout that very large country of the Philippines. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how Duarte manages the country rather than just talking about the foreign relations, because you did allude in your talk to the killings going on to try to control the drug trade. But I don't know other than that any of the national what's going on. Sorry to take so long to pose my question, but I have to congratulate you first.
I mean, thank you for the question. I apologize if it took me 50 minutes to get through it. I really wanted to explain it as clearly as possible.
Perfect.
Sort of the intricacies and complexities of like what's happening in my country. It should be clear that Duterte has been the most popular president in the Philippines for the longest time. Usually, the way Philippine politics works, similar to the United States, before the midterm elections, there's a midterm elections in the Philippines. It's only it's after the third year, not after 2 years. The popularity of the president goes down by a huge margin. And this has happened to, I think, the past 3 or 4 presidents in the Philippines. Usually after the third year, popularity goes down. And then you have political fracturing. So similar to the United States, when a president wins, you have coalition formation because coalitions want to forward their agendas. And after the midterm elections, when they see the president has started to weaken, coalitions would now disperse. So people are predicting this with Biden, for instance. This never happened under Duterte until recently. After the midterm elections, he remained to be very popular, he remained to be very strong. I think his popularity went from 80% to 65%, which is crazy because the other presidents started at like 50% or 60%, and they went down to 20%. And then this was a trend that was only true in the 1960s or 1950s. So Duterte was able to revive that. Why is he strong? The big question. Autocratic politics is a big thing. He has a huge social media group that sort of like talks about his popularity and talks about the great things he's done. He's very charismatic. The average Filipino sort of sees himself through Duterte. And a lot of local politicians follow the same thing. They're afraid of Duterte's ability to influence the elections against them. If he says something, if he actually tells one thing, that might lead to another. A huge part of it in my analysis is that it goes back to his own war coffers, his own money, his own savings to be able to pay for the social media groups in order to pay for local officials. And where did this come from? Who are the biggest side payers or rent-seeking payers of the Duterte? Online gambling firms. So in my analysis, it really goes back to the huge war coffer that the Duterte family has been able to accumulate during his time. And that did not come from the Chinese government, that did not come from American companies, that did not come from like embezzling from Philippine budget. It came from online gambling companies, which are super profitable and that made monthly payments to the Duterte government.
And what control does the Duterte family have over the general population, other than through the popularity, as you explained to us, that the general population does feel that the Duterte family is looking after their interests.
Yeah.
But if you look at some of the statistics I got were, for example, that the Philippines has the 73rd worst free economy in the region. You know, it's noted terrible, terrible in terms of open markets and things of that nature. So the country itself seems to be going downhill or problematic, you know, rather than under this strong family doing well.
If I could re-explain parts of this, there's a big disconnect between these macroeconomic indicators and sort of like what people feel. The person who did the economy right was Aquino III. He made the Philippines into an economic sort of like star in Southeast Asia, 2010 to 2016. Duterte made it worse, I agree with you. But he had a lot of populist programs. So for instance, a lot of like, infrastructure programs and a lot of like, free schooling and a lot of like programs that sort of like, that actually directly like gives money to like people. He had a lot of those programs. That's number one. Number two, his social media group was able to discredit his social media group, his own like troll factories. It discredits whatever news comes out of the media. It discredits CNN, BBC, or like one of the mainstream media organizations. Duterte has control of the police and sort of the courts and a lot of these other institutions. So he was able to civil society actors and independent media. He was able to curtail those. So in terms of information, in terms of like what people understand, he was able to sort of like maneuver it in a way that if something bad happens, people don't blame the family. People blame something else, including the Americans. So I would agree with those macroeconomic indicators, but I don't think the people on the ground actually agree with them, because if something bad happens, they wouldn't blame the Duterte government. More importantly, it's definitely possible for the economy to go bad at the same time what people feel to be good, to be better. You can spend a lot on people. You can give them projects and you can give them free education, yet it's bad for your economy in the long run. And that's what's happening. It's more of a populist government that attempts to win the population over through these programs, yet in the long run, it's going to be bad for the economy, as what you said.
Yes, yes, yes. And at one of your slides showed the Secretary of Defense being over in the Philippines. And I wondered how important those kinds of personal relationships are in the foreign policy of the United States and the Philippines.
So a lot of the Secretary of Defense in the Philippines, Delphine Lorenzana, and a lot of the Philippine generals and Philippine military officials, they have strong relationships with the American military. So a lot of the Philippine officers, when they finish their training, they actually go to West Point to get their own training. And you have a lot of these exchanges and sort of like informal linkages to friendships between the American and Philippine military. And it is through this military personnel, the officials and both the military, the Navy, the Army, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, and the civilian officials in defense, they're precisely the people who have maintained Philippine-American relations. As what I said a while ago, the institutional linkages exist. And when Duterte says a bombastic statement, the officials come in and sort of 10%. Now, crucially, despite this institutional linkage, I would like to note that this is not permanent. This is an evolving situation. The more that you will get Philippine military officials trained under China and actually go back and sort of like ascend in the role as leaders of the military, the less you will have these institutional linkages. And China has made real progress here. A lot of the low-level Philippine officers, some of them don't go to West Point, some of them go to Shanghai, some of them go to Beijing. So there's Chinese expansion in the Philippines has been overstated, yet it would be important not to understate it, to sort of see that there's some changes. They're gradual, they're very small, yet there are changes. In social science theory, change is never drastic in a way. That never happens. Change is always gradual. Change is always, it comes in small and tiny pieces.
Yeah, thank you for that. Mal, I see that you've got a question on the tip of your tongue here. you want to share with us?
Once Don started asking you the questions about Philippine politics, it came to mind that for a long time, there's been speculation that Duterte's daughter would run to replace him in the May elections. And then all of a sudden she backed out and decided not to run for the presidency. But Ferdinand Marcos' son supposedly has thrown his hat in the ring. First question is that reasonable? Second question, does it matter? And third, does it have any impact on this foreign policy profile that you've described, or is this just political something or other?
Well, thank you for that question. Now, it seems to be clear you're watching whoever, sorry, I'm not going to look at the name of the question.
You don't see it there. I'm just coming from me.
Oh, it's coming from you. Okay. You're obviously watching Philippine politics, and it's really messy. If I know the answer to this question, I wouldn't be a professor. I would be back home being a political operator, and I would make millions of dollars instead of $100,000 a year. Not a lot. It's really hard to say what's happening. It's really messy. The daughter of Duterte is now the vice president candidate under the son of the former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. His name is Bongbong Marcos. So there's a Bongbong Marcos Sara Duterte ticket. Now, Duterte himself has decided to run for the vice presidency. There was a ticket between Bongo, and so Bongo is Duterte's right-hand man. He's sort of like he's sort of like the sidekick. He doesn't really have a good, if you see every Duterte picture, every Duterte video, you will see Bongo. He doesn't have a good personality. He's very uncharismatic. But Duterte vouched for him as president. To be the president. Duterte decided to run for the vice president candidacy of under Bongo. So it's going to be Duterte, Rodrigo against his daughter, Sara. However, a few days ago, Rodrigo said, "Oh, I'm decided not to. Maybe I shouldn't run as a vice president. I'm going to run as a senator." So it's really messy. Nobody knows what's happening. People speculate that it's a smokescreen for to make it appear that the administration is fighting, and then eventually they're going to come together. It's hard to say. Duterte in his press conference the other day said there's a president candidate who's a weak leader and who does cocaine, who smokes a lot of cocaine. And he was pertaining to Bongbong Marcos himself, which is really weird because they were friends for the longest time. Now it seems to be like they're fighting. It doesn't make sense. But from my own understanding of how it works, I think it's still possible for Sara to sort of like run as the president, and then Bongo becomes the vice president. It's hard to say. I don't exactly know why Sara is working with Marcos. It doesn't make sense to me, because for me, it might just come back to the way people have analyzed it is that it's simply political disagreement within the faction. Within the Duterte faction, there's a disagreement between who should who should take over. Should it be Sara Duterte or should it be Bongo? And some of them sided up with Bong. Some of them sided with Sara. So it's just messy, and I can't really say what's happening. But does it matter to Philippine-China relations? Not so much. All of this are all of these actors, all of these elites are willing to work with China. China is a good friend of Bongbong Marcos. There's a Chinese consulate in Bongbong Marcos comes from the family in the northern province of Ilocos. And one of the few Chinese consulates is actually in Ilocos. And it's been there since 2005. All of these actors are like Duterte. They're willing to work with the Chinese at the expense of the Filipinos, at the expense of the Americans. Will they work with the Chinese forever, or are they going to be Chinese lapdogs? I don't believe so. I think they will sell out the Chinese if it's convenient. But are they bad for the Philippines? Are they bad for Philippine-American relations? I think so.
The question that you saw was from our third person, Tyler Reed, who was saying, looking at the economic value of the Americans within the Philippines. And I guess my question is, there must be now an economic Chinese value working its way as well into into the Philippines itself. One of the things that I'm going to switch from local politics, if I may, to regional politics. And one of the things that intrigues me is, first of all, why the world doesn't change the name of the South China Sea to South something else, South Asia Sea or something like that. By that I mean, what's Philippines doing with Vietnam and Cambodia and those other countries to create some united resistance to what China is trying to do with building its islands and enlarging all these areas for its fishing boats to go? There should be some kind of, within the region, pushback, united pushback, but that doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah. So your question has 2 points. Number one, why is it that they haven't changed the name yet? I don't know. I guess that if you change the name, China's going to be offended. But at the same time, China is encroaching not on the South China Sea. The way it works is that a country has an exclusive economic zone of like 10 nautical miles from the shore. And the exclusive economic zone allows a country to have exclusive economic activities, exploring oil, doing fishing activities. What China is doing is it's expanding the South China Sea towards the exclusive economic zone of the Vietnam and the Philippines. And this is where the issues happen. So the Philippines has renamed the exclusive economic zone as like West Philippine Sea. So, and that's where the issues happen. The Philippines is not really interested in like sort of like the other parts of the South China Sea or sort of like, the parts of the South China Sea that overlap with Vietnam. So I don't really know why the name issue hasn't like changed yet. My guess is that it's impossible to get it across. It's simply impossible. I mean, you can't even get the Xinjiang issue in ASEAN and like the United Nations. And my God, there's a cultural genocide happening in Western China right now. The Xinjiang population is horrible. Yet nobody will agree on that because nobody wants to offend China.
Yes.
Now, why is there no effective response by Southeast Asian countries against China? The simple reason is simply it's a collective action problem. Countries want to maintain their good relations with China, so they let other countries fight for them, fight for their interests, and they try not to say something. So, for instance, Philippines and Vietnam have the biggest disputes with China in terms of territories. But Indonesia and Malaysia are concerned as well about China. But Indonesia and Malaysia are concerned about they're concerned about smaller amounts of territories. The Philippines and Vietnam have a bigger dispute with China than Indonesia and Malaysia. So what Indonesia and Malaysia do is they keep silent and they let the Philippines do their work for them, which is a bad way of doing regional alliances because you're riding on what other people are doing, right? The other problem is that ASEAN itself works by it has to be unanimous. If one ASEAN member disagrees, then you cannot have an effective position against anything. So in this particular case, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, what else? Myanmar, Singapore. Their stance on this is like, we don't want. Their stance on this is like, we'll let it be. We'll let things happen. We're not gonna get in the way. Yet they don't want to do anything. The Philippines and Vietnam are like, we have to do something. And then Cambodia is a friend of China. Cambodia tells the ASEAN, we can't do anything. We shouldn't offend China. So one can argue that ASEAN cannot make an effective response because Cambodia has been there and Cambodia has been the Chinese Trojan horse in ASEAN.
Can I follow on that, Donald?
Go ahead. We have a number of questions from the outside that I think we should get to.
But following around on that question, what is the increasing influence of the Quad or the Australian, US activity, the big countries have on those third-tier countries that you described, Alvin, in terms of making some progress toward their own self-interest other than their relationships with China? Are the big guys having a play?
I'm sorry, can you explain the question a bit more?
Well, we see the Quad moving ahead.
Yeah.
We see the US-Australia project moving ahead. Is the movement of first and second tier countries having any impact on those third-tier countries that you described so effectively that are part of ASEAN.
Right. There is influence, but any influence has to be domestically interpolated. You do have international movement from Quad countries, Japan, the United States, Australia. Now, how do local actors interpret what's happening? That's the big issue. If in most cases, many Southeast Asian states don't think that these countries are willing to come in to defend them from China when something happens. As a result, what these countries do is they still pursue their own interests and they do not put any. In my view, a lot of political elites will not say it. They will not say that, oh, we don't believe in the United States, we don't believe in the Quad. They need it, right? If the worst case happens, these countries have nowhere to run to except the United States and Australia. Australia is not even enough to counter China. The United States has to be there, right? Yet, because these countries are, because the United States and Australia, you have a credibility problem. I mean, are Americans really willing to sort of like go there and sort of like fight like the South, fight in the South China Sea? I mean, Afghanistan, they put it on Afghanistan, right? And then there's a big question: are the Americans going to defend Taiwan? Are the Americans going to defend like Southeast Asia if China invades? That's a big question for a lot of Southeast Asian states. As a result, a lot of Southeast Asian states, a lot of Southeast Asian elites, they don't put their eggs on it. What they do is they try to play both sides. And this is what's been happening. This is the so-called hedging. They work with both countries and see what's best for them.
So there are two questions in a way from outside having to do with the environment. For example, one of them asks about how damaging the Chinese fishing is coming in so close to the Philippines. And the other one asks about what will be the effects of global warming on the Philippines itself. Yeah. I imagine what they're referring to is the rise in sea levels, for example.
Right, for sure. Well, thank you for both questions. Yeah, Chinese fishing has been very, very damaging. They use far more environmentally corrosive, harmful fishing technology. So people have calculated coral reef damage to have reached billions of dollars. I think $9 to $10 billion in the past like 10 years. The Chinese fishing ships, there's so many of them. They like outnumber the Southeast Asian. They outnumber all of Southeast Asian fishing ships by 10. It's a 10-to-1 difference. So 10-to-1 difference between China and Southeast Asia. These ships like go around Southeast Asia. They like get as many fishes as they could. That means there's very little left for Southeast Asian states. Then it destroys the coral reefs. It destroys the environment. And then the externalities are now left there. And the Southeast Asian states have to deal with this like, post damage cleanup, which is really horrible. When it comes to climate change, great question. Just like any place in the world, but as a big island state, the Philippines is dealing with a lot of what we call this rising sea levels. People expect it in the next 50 years that the sea levels are going to inundate and sort of like cover the beach areas and sort of like the areas in the Philippines near the sea. I think in the next 50 years it's going to happen. Sea levels have been rising, and then parts of Manila are now covered underwater, but very, very small. Still, in the next 50 years, it's hard not to imagine that it's going to cover like a big parts of it. My dad recently moved from parts of the city, in the good part of the city, to like, he now built a big house up in the mountains overlooking the city. So I know that he and his family are going to be safe. So that's fine.
In the future. You have done very well. I want to congratulate you for coming when I needed you. If you remember, the speaker we had organized bowed out because of COVID reasons, and I approached you relatively recently, and you were wonderful enough to agree to be part of our program. And I want to say how wonderful you turned out to be. Thank you. I love your enthusiasm, your young ways of dealing with the world and not taking old people's issues, saying this is the way it is, the relationship is because Duterte is bowing to the Chinese. And here you went and looked at in more depth into the possible reasons which come closer to home in the sense of the families and the gambling and the force of really capitalism in this world. So thank you for that. And I hand you over to Mal, who is going to thank you as well, I think. Plus, he's got a phone call at the same time. Hello, Joe.
He's going to trash that call. Thank you, Professor Camba. We really appreciate your participation today. Thanks also to Don, our moderator and recruiter. We appreciate all the support we get from the Chappaqua Library, Carrie and Joan, etc. And we thank all of you who choose to join us from wherever you are. On the 13th of December, we have another speaker, our final speaker of the year, Valley Nasser from Johns Hopkins. He will be talking to us about the Middle East and Iraq, and I'm sorry, and Iran. Till then, please be safe, have a good holiday, take care of yourself, and Joan, we're ready to leave.
And I just want to thank everyone from the planning committee and of course Alvin for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And your maps and all the PowerPoint was wonderful, very relating right to what we were looking at, what we were hearing. I love that kind of stuff. So thank you very much. And I want to again thank Don. You did a great job. You just pulled it all together. Thank you. So I want to wish the rest of the community and the speakers a wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope you all have a chance to celebrate, stay safe, and stay well. We will pick it up again in December 9th when I'm having the program from Trump to Biden and U.S.-China relations. Hope to see you all then. Please go to our website, chappaqua.library.org. All right, thanks all.
Again, bye.
Bye.
And bye-bye.